I remember the silence before anything else. It was thicker than smoke, heavier than the mud that clung to our boots. After the fighting stopped, the world didn't go quiet. It just began to echo. Every step I took in those ruins sounded like a memory trying to climb back into the present. You think the end of the war means peace, but peace doesn't sound the way you expect. It doesn't hum with relief or victory. It hums like tinnitus, a long, thin, ringing line that never fades. The city was gone by the time we got there. The map still showed streets, but there was only rubble, steel twisted like bones, and walls without roofs. I was assigned to the reconstruction detail, clearing debris, marking unexploded shells, helping with the wounded that were still being found in basements weeks after the last gunfire. We were told it was over, but I didn't believe it, because every night, when the wind moved through the ruins, I could hear them. Not voices exactly, more like fragments of sound that my brain tried to turn into meaning. Sometimes a laugh, sometimes my name, sometimes an order that no one had given. The medic said it was combat fatigue. I'd been too close to an artillery blast a month earlier. They said my ears might never stop ringing. But it wasn't just ringing. There were words in it. I'd wake up at night certain that someone was calling from the next room, only to find nothing but dust falling through beams of moonlight. I stopped mentioning it to the others. The first time I told someone, they looked at me the same way we used to look at the ones who'd lost too much. Like I was already halfway gone. It's strange how memory behaves after a war. It's not a line. It's a loop. You don't move forward. You circle around the same images until they lose their edges. There was one sound that haunted me most. The voice of Corporal Davis. He'd been with me in the same trench the night he was hit. I still remember his last breath, sharp and unfinished. After that, in the ruins, I kept hearing him say my name, just once, over and over, as if the war had never told him it was over. I knew it wasn't real. I told myself that 100 times. But when the night stretched long and the wind moved through the wreckage, knowing and believing were two different things. During the day, I tried to drown it out with work. We lifted bricks, cleared roads, built makeshift bridges from the rubble. Every sound, hammering, shouting, trucks rumbling, was a kind of mercy. Noise meant I could think about something else. But when the tools stopped, when the sun went down and the air turned cold, the echoes returned. I'd find myself pausing in the middle of a broken street, certain that someone had whispered right behind me. Once, I even answered out loud, "Yeah?" like an idiot. The others stared. I laughed it off, said I thought I heard an officer. They didn't ask again. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from realizing that what you hear, what you feel, isn't shared by anyone else. The war taught us how to live with pain, but not with silence. Silence has texture. It presses against your ears until your thoughts sound louder than anything around you. Some nights I'd hear the rhythm of footsteps where there were none, or the click of a rifle bolt in a building that had collapsed weeks ago. I'd go searching through the debris with a lantern, half hoping to find someone alive, half knowing I wouldn't. The doctors called it residual stress response. They said the brain, after months of constant noise and threat, doesn't know how to stop listening for danger. Even when it's safe, it keeps waiting for the next shot, the next scream. So when there's no sound, it creates one, like an addict deprived of the substance it was built to survive on. I understood that, but understanding didn't help. Every time I heard a voice, it felt real, and each time it vanished, it left a heavier silence behind. One evening, while searching a bombed-out schoolhouse, I found a chalkboard still standing. Across it were the last words someone had written before the bombs fell: "Silence until the siren." The chalk was half erased by dust, but those words stuck in my mind. Silence until the siren. That's what life felt like now, waiting for the next alarm even when you knew it wasn't coming. I used to think the worst part of war was the fear. It's not. The worst part is learning to live after the fear has nowhere left to go. I started keeping a notebook. Just small observations, sketches, notes about the things I heard. I wasn't trying to write history, I just wanted proof that I hadn't imagined everything. 5:32 p.m. Sound of boots on glass. 2:15 a.m. Whisper, get down. No source found. The notebook became a kind of anchor. If I could describe it, I could control it. But soon, even that began to slip. The more I wrote, the more uncertain I became. What if the act of writing made it worse? What if giving it shape gave it strength? A few weeks later, we were reassigned to help with the local civilians, those who'd survived by hiding underground. They were silent too. Entire families that hadn't spoken above a whisper in months. One woman told me she still flinched every time she heard a kettle whistle. Another said she slept better when she could hear trains. The noise reminded her that the world still moved. I began to realize that maybe everyone was hearing something. We were all haunted, just in different ways. One night, while walking patrol, I passed a church that had lost its roof. Inside, the pews were buried under debris, and the organ pipes were bent and blackened. But when the wind passed through them, they made a sound. Faint, dissonant, like someone breathing through metal. I stood there for a long time listening. The sound wasn't a ghost. It wasn't madness. It was air and memory colliding. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Because maybe the voices weren't trying to haunt me. Maybe they were just the war's way of saying it wasn't finished speaking. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I heard Davis again. Clearer this time. He said only one thing, you made it. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I wasn't afraid of the voices anymore. I was afraid of the day they'd stop. They sent me to a rest station after that. Not a hospital, they said, just a place to clear your head. The building used to be a manor before the war turned it into a sanctuary for the broken. There were no uniforms there, only faces that had forgotten how to belong anywhere else. Men sat on benches, staring at their hands as if waiting for orders that would never come. The walls were pale, the air smelled of disinfectant and cold tea. Outside, you could still hear distant hammering from reconstruction crews. But inside, the only rhythm was the ticking of a clock that someone had forgotten to wind. The doctor in charge, Captain Miller, wasn't much older than me. He spoke softly. Like every word was a truce he was afraid to break. He asked when the voices began, what they said, how often I heard them. I told him the truth, that they weren't always clear and that I didn't think they were ghosts. He nodded, wrote something down, then asked if I wanted something to help me sleep. I said no, I didn't want to drown them. I wanted to understand them. The others thought the same thing. Every man there had his own private noise. One muttered prayers in a language I didn't recognize. Another hummed a tune all night because silence made him shake. One man claimed he could still hear the sound of artillery in his dreams, not explosions, but the metallic click before they fired. He said he could count them like a metronome. I listened to him, wondering if we were all just different versions of the same echo. Days passed slowly there. We weren't expected to talk much, only to eat, rest, and sometimes walk the gardens behind the house. The gardens had survived somehow. A few dead trees, patches of grass, and a small pond that reflected the shattered windows. I used to walk there at dusk. The frogs were gone, but sometimes I'd hear a splash, as if something unseen moved under the surface. The nurses said it was probably rats or debris. But one night, I thought I heard someone say, "Don't look." Just those two words, carried by the wind. I froze, waited, and told myself it was nothing. Yet part of me, the part that had lived too long with ghosts made of sound, didn't believe that anymore. One afternoon, Captain Miller handed me a pair of headphones. "Try these," he said. We used them for desensitization. They played recorded noises, explosions, gunfire, shouting. The idea was to retrain the brain, make the sounds ordinary again. I listened. At first, my body tensed, but after a while it became background noise. Then he switched the tape. It was silence. Just the hiss of an empty channel. That's when I heard it again, faint but familiar, my name. Not shouted this time, but whispered, patient, almost kind. You made it. I took off the headphones and stared at Miller. He looked confused. What did you hear? He asked. I said, nothing. He smiled like that was progress. I stopped telling them the truth after that, because I realized something. The voices weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to remind me of something I hadn't faced yet. You can treat a wound, you can clean the blood, but you can't erase the sound of it. The brain records it, plays it back again and again, until it makes sense. Except it never really does. Some nights, I wondered if the voices were just memory, trying to finish the conversations the war had interrupted. There was one nurse who never asked questions. Margaret. She had a face that looked like it had learned to hide kindness behind exhaustion. She brought me tea every evening and left without speaking. One night she sat beside me on the porch. Do you hear them now? She asked quietly. Her tone wasn't mocking. It was like she already knew the answer. I nodded. She didn't move. My brother hears them too, she said. He came back last year. Sometimes he talks to them. What does he say? I asked. That he's sorry, she whispered. The words hit harder than any diagnosis. Sorry. That was the sound that had been echoing all along. Not ghosts, not madness, guilt, the kind that doesn't vanish when the gunfire stops. I started thinking about Davis again. The last order I gave him, to run left when we were ambushed. He didn't make it 10 feet. If I'd said right, maybe he would have lived. Maybe the voice saying you made it wasn't comfort. Maybe it was accusation. That night I wrote a letter I never sent. It started with I'm sorry and ended with nothing. Just blank space. Because what apology could matter to someone buried under a city that doesn't exist anymore? I tore it up the next morning, but the words stayed. As weeks passed, I learned to carry silence differently. Not as an enemy, but as a weight. It pressed down, but it also grounded me. Miller said I was improving. You're integrating the trauma, he told me, as if it were something you could fold neatly into the rest of your life. But the truth was, I just got better at hiding it. I smiled when they asked. I said the voices were gone. They weren't. They'd just changed. They no longer called my name. They echoed my thoughts instead. Sometimes I'd be looking at the pond, and a voice would say, "You'll never leave." Not threatening, just factual. And deep down, I knew it was right. Before leaving the facility, they gave each of us a form to fill out, a promise, really. Do you feel capable of resuming normal duties? I checked yes, not because I believed it, but because I didn't want to stay. The world outside was broken, but at least it was honest about it. Inside those pale walls, everyone pretended healing was a destination. I knew better. Healing wasn't forward motion. It was learning how to walk in circles without falling apart. When I finally returned to the city, the ruins looked different. They weren't haunted anymore. They were hollow, emptied of the things I'd once imagined inside them. The voices had followed me, of course, but they were quieter now, more like thoughts that had forgotten where they began. Sometimes I'd stand in the same street where Davis died and listen. The wind still moved through the shattered buildings, making that same low hum. But now, instead of fear, it brought something else. Understanding, maybe. Or resignation. I spent my days helping rebuild the town square. The stones we lifted had scorch marks from old fires. One of the younger workers asked if I ever thought about leaving, finding somewhere new. I told him the truth. There's no such thing as somewhere new, only somewhere else. He didn't understand. He will, I thought, someday. One morning, while clearing debris near the cathedral, I found something buried in the dirt, a fragment of a dog tag. Not Davis's, but someone else's. The name was half gone, the metal blackened. I kept it in my pocket. Every time the wind rose, I'd touch it, just to feel something real, something heavy. It became my proof that the dead weren't angry. They were simply waiting to be remembered. The last night before we left the city, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching fog roll through the empty streets. Then I heard it again, that same voice, distant but unmistakable. You made it. Only this time, I answered. We all did. The wind moved through the broken walls, carrying the words somewhere I couldn't follow. Maybe that's what survival really is. Not escaping the voices, but learning to speak back. Home didn't look like home anymore. The roofs were patched with tin, the streets quieter than I remembered, and the air smelled of smoke and soap, as if the whole town had tried to wash itself clean and failed. My mother's house still stood, but barely. The paint peeled like old skin, and the garden had turned to mud. She didn't ask questions when she saw me. She just touched my face and said, "You came back thin." I nodded, unable to tell her that I'd left half of myself behind, somewhere I couldn't name. For the first few weeks, I moved like a ghost through familiar places. The bakery where I used to buy bread was gone. The church bell no longer rang. The children who played in the streets spoke softer, like laughter was rationed now. At night, the town sank into silence so complete that it felt unnatural. That's when the voices returned, not whispers anymore, but echoes. Sometimes I'd hear boots in the hallway, the rustle of a uniform, the low murmur of men sharing cigarettes. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just the walls breathing. I tried to convince myself it was memory misfiring, the brain replaying what it couldn't process. But one evening, while sitting at the kitchen table, I heard someone behind me say, "It's still burning." The voice was calm, not accusing. I turned, and the chair opposite mine was empty, except for a faint impression on the wood, as if someone had been sitting there seconds ago. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The clock ticked. The house exhaled, and I realized that the war hadn't ended. It had simply changed its uniform. The next morning, I visited the local post office, hoping to find letters from the men who'd survived. There were none. The clerk handed me a single envelope, addressed in a familiar hand, mine. I'd written it months ago, during recovery, but never sent it. "I'm sorry," it said on the first line. The rest was blank. I folded it back into the envelope and kept it in my pocket. Sometimes silence weighs more than words ever could. I tried working again, repairing roofs, fixing windows. Anything to stay busy. The sound of hammering helped. It was clean, honest, predictable. But every time the nail hit wood, I'd hear a faint echo underneath it, like another rhythm trying to surface. One afternoon, I dropped the hammer because I could swear someone had said, "Too late." I looked around, heart pounding. No one there, just the wind moving through the beams. I laughed, but it didn't sound like laughter. It sounded like surrender, the villagers noticed. They didn't say much, but I could see it in their eyes. That mixture of pity and fear reserved for those who'd brought pieces of the front back with them. They'd nod politely, speak softly, and then watch me walk away as if waiting for me to break. Maybe they were right, because the truth was I didn't feel human anymore. I felt like an instrument that had forgotten its purpose, still resonating, but without music. One day, while repairing the church roof, I found something hidden under a loose tile, a piece of parchment, yellowed and torn. It was a list of names, soldiers, my unit, every one of them dead. Someone had written at the bottom, "For those who answered when silence called." I stared at it for a long time. The handwriting wasn't mine, but I recognized the letters, Davis's. My throat closed. I didn't know how it got there. Maybe someone had brought it back. Maybe I was supposed to find it, or maybe it had always been waiting. That night I dreamed of the ruins again. Only this time they weren't empty. The men were there. Davis, Carter, Young, sitting around a fire that didn't give off light. Their faces were calm, peaceful even. "It's done," Davis said. "You can stop listening." I woke up with the taste of ash in my mouth. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the air felt lighter, as if something unseen had finally exhaled. For the first time in months, I walked to the river. The water was low and brown, carrying bits of wood and dead leaves. I sat on the bank and listened, not for voices, but for the world itself. The river's murmur was steady, indifferent. Somewhere in the distance a bell rang. Not from the church, but from the railway station, signaling a train that wouldn't arrive for hours. The sound drifted over the fields like memory pretending to be hope. People think the war ends when the guns stop. It doesn't. It ends the day you stop hearing it inside yourself. For me, that day hadn't come yet. Every time a door slammed, I flinched. Every time someone shouted, my body went rigid. It wasn't fear anymore, it was recognition. My mind kept searching for danger like a dog chasing a scent long gone. Captain Miller used to call it the reflex of survival. I called it the echo. Months passed. I started keeping a notebook, not of names but of sounds. The crunch of frost under boots, the creak of wood when the wind shifted, the clatter of a spoon against a cup. I wrote them down as if by naming them I could strip them of their power. But one night, while writing, I realized something terrifying. I couldn't remember the sound of peace. I could describe silence, but not peace. They were not the same thing. Silence was an absence. Peace was a decision, and I hadn't made it yet. Winter came early that year. The snow covered the ruins like a confession. The world looked clean again, but it wasn't. Underneath, the bones of the old city still waited. One morning, I walked through what used to be the main square. Children were building a snowman near a burned-out tank. They laughed, that fragile kind of laughter that sounds like it could break at any moment. I stopped listening. For the first time, the laughter didn't sound wrong. It sounded possible, like maybe the world hadn't forgotten how to live after all. I decided to visit the rest station again. The manor was still there, though quieter. The garden had grown wild, and the pond had frozen solid. Inside, the hall smelled of dust and paper. Captain Miller was gone. A new doctor, younger, greeted me with the kind of politeness reserved for strangers. I asked if they still used the headphones. He smiled and said yes, but now the recordings were different. Less noise, he said. More space. I didn't understand until I tried them. The tape began with static, then faded into the sound of wind and waves. It wasn't silence. It was something alive, something that moved. I closed my eyes, and somewhere in that sound I heard it again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Not my name this time, just one word, enough. When I took off the headphones, I was crying. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time, the voice didn't feel like it came from outside. It felt like it came from within, from the part of me that had been trying to catch up to the world since the day the war ended. I walked back into town that evening as snow began to fall. The streetlights flickered, and for a moment every shadow looked familiar. The cold bit at my hands, but I didn't mind. Somewhere behind me a door creaked open, the sound sharp, precise. I turned, half expecting to see someone there. No one, just the wind moving through. And yet I smiled, because for once the sound didn't fill me with dread. It felt like proof that I was still here, still listening. People say that time heals everything. They're wrong. Time doesn't heal. It just teaches you how to carry the wound without reopening it. The voices never left me, but they changed. They became softer, slower, almost kind. Reminders that I had lived and that living meant remembering. When I lay in bed that night, I finally understood what Captain Miller meant about integration. You don't erase the noise. You become it. You learn its rhythm until it no longer startles you. The war becomes background music, the kind that never quite fades, but no longer drowns out your own voice. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the ruins, the town, the graves. I closed my eyes and listened to the soft, steady sound of flakes against the window pane, a sound without violence, without command. And somewhere in that fragile hush, I found it at last, not silence but peace. Years later, they asked me to record my memories for the War Museum. We're preserving testimonies, the letter said, before they vanish. I almost didn't go. What could I say that hadn't already been said 1,000 times by men who wore the same uniform, marched through the same mud, stared at the same sky? But something about that word, vanish, unsettled me. The idea that what we lived could simply fade, like smoke absorbed by the air, felt wrong. I didn't want the voices to disappear. I wanted them to mean something. The museum was small, built in what used to be the town hall. The curator, a thin woman with a soft voice, led me into a narrow room lined with shelves of reel-to-reel tapes. The labels read only numbers. No names, no ranks. Just ghosts filed in order. She showed me the recording equipment, a simple microphone on a wooden desk. "Just speak naturally," she said. "Tell us what you remember." She smiled, then left me alone. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the recorder. I sat there for a long time, unsure where to begin. Memory doesn't move in straight lines. It circles, folds, hides behind smells and sounds. I closed my eyes and saw the ruins again, not as they were, but as my mind kept them. The smoke, the brick dust, the flickering light of fires that refused to die. And I began to speak. I told them about the day the shelling stopped, about the stillness that followed. I told them how the silence wasn't peace, but the echo of absence. I spoke of Davis, of the men whose laughter had once filled the air like music, and how, after the bombing, I could still hear them in the dust. My voice shook, but I kept talking. Words flowed out like a dam breaking after years of pressure. I said things I hadn't even told myself. Halfway through, I realized I wasn't describing a battle. I was describing a sound. The sound of boots through rubble, the hiss of rain on hot metal, the brittle crack of walls collapsing. And somewhere underneath it all, the whisper, not from outside, but from within. The one that said, "You survived, I stopped then." The tape kept spinning, waiting. The room felt heavy, as if it too were listening. I didn't know how to explain that surviving isn't always victory, that sometimes it's a quieter kind of punishment. I leaned toward the microphone and said, "People think memory is a way to keep the past alive. But sometimes it's how the past keeps you alive." The words surprised me as I spoke them. They didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded like truth. When I left the museum, it was raining. The cobblestones gleamed, and the smell of wet earth brought back the front lines, the trenches after a storm, water rising to our knees, mud swallowing our boots. I stood under the awning, watching people hurry past. None of them looked up. They didn't know what this rain used to mean to us, how it once carried the stench of gunpowder and blood. I didn't blame them. The world had moved on. But I wondered how many wars were still echoing quietly inside men who looked ordinary. That night, I played the radio just to fill the space. The announcer's voice crackled through static, reading names of soldiers being honored in the capital. I didn't know any of them, but the rhythm of the roll call brought tears to my eyes. It reminded me of something Davis once said. "When they call your name and you can't answer, make sure someone remembers how you sounded." I had never understood what he meant until now. In the following weeks, the museum sent me a copy of my tape. They said it would be archived for historical research. I kept it on the table beside my bed, inside a small wooden box. Some nights, I'd play it softly just to hear myself speak, to prove that I existed beyond the noise. My voice sounded older, tired, but steady. It was strange, hearing myself talk about ghosts without trembling. Maybe the act of naming them had given them rest. One evening, my neighbor's boy came to visit. He was about 10, curious, full of questions about the war. "Was it scary?" he asked. I hesitated. How do you explain fear to someone who's never had to ration silence? "It wasn't just scary," I said. "It was loud. Even when it was quiet." He frowned, not understanding, so I handed him the tape recorder. "Here," I said. "Press play," he did. My voice filled the room, calm and distant, the sound of boots through rubble. The whisper that says, "You survived." He listened for a moment, then stopped the tape. "It sounds like you're talking to someone," he said. "I was," I replied. "I just didn't know who." After he left, I sat by the window, watching dusk settle over the fields. The horizon glowed faintly, a line between what was and what remained. I thought of all the men whose stories never made it onto tape, those who never found the words or the courage to speak. Their silence was part of our history too, the kind you can't preserve on reels. As the years passed, I grew accustomed to the quiet. The voices came less often, not because they were gone, but because they no longer needed to shout. They'd done their job. They'd kept me alive long enough to remember them. Sometimes, when I walked through the old ruins, I'd whisper their names just to hear how they sounded against the wind. The air would catch, twist, and carry them away. I liked to think that somewhere those names still traveled, unbroken, through the distance. One winter evening, decades after the recording, I returned to the museum. The curator was different now, younger. She recognized my name and smiled. "We digitized the archives," she said. "Would you like to hear your tape?" I nodded. She led me to a computer and clicked play. The sound that emerged wasn't just my voice. There was something else layered beneath it, a faint hum, a frequency the microphone had captured by accident. It pulsed softly, almost rhythmic, like breath. The curator apologized for the interference, but I shook my head. "That's not interference," I said quietly. "That's them." She didn't understand, but she smiled politely, thinking I meant other veterans. I didn't correct her. When the recording ended, I sat in silence. The hum lingered in my ears long after the playback stopped. It wasn't haunting. It was comforting. Proof that nothing truly disappears. It just changes form. Maybe that's what Davis had been trying to tell me all those years ago. The war doesn't end. It just learns how to whisper. Outside, the museum courtyard was covered in frost. The fountain in the center had frozen mid-splash, each droplet suspended, like time refusing to move. I touched the cold marble rim and felt the vibration of the world, faint, steady, alive. For the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of the sound. I walked home slowly, passing through streets that had been rebuilt, though I could still trace the outlines of the old ones beneath. People say reconstruction erases the past. It doesn't. It buries it under new names, new paint, new laughter. But if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the rhythm of the old city beating quietly under the pavement. That night, before sleeping, I placed the tape recorder on my chest and pressed play one last time. My voice filled the room again, older now, layered with the hiss of time. "The war ends the day you stop hearing it inside yourself," I had said back then. I smiled. Maybe it never ends. Maybe it just becomes part of your heartbeat. The tape clicked, the reel spun out, and silence followed, not empty but full of breath, memory, and the faint hum of life continuing. I closed my eyes, listening, and thought, maybe this is what peace sounds like. When I was gone, they found the tape. It was sitting on the nightstand beside my bed, next to a folded photograph of my unit and a half-burned candle. The nurse said I had passed quietly, as if I'd simply fallen asleep, listening to the past. The tape had stopped halfway through a sentence. No one knew what I was about to say, and maybe that was how it was meant to end, unfinished, like most things born of war. Months later, the museum announced an exhibit, Echoes of the Front. My recording was included. It played on a loop in a dimly lit room, surrounded by artifacts, helmets, dog tags, faded letters, and photographs of men whose faces blurred into one another. Visitors came and went, pausing to listen. Some leaned closer, drawn by the low timbre of my voice. Others stood back, their expressions unreadable, as if they were afraid of recognizing something too familiar. A young historian named Anna was curating the exhibit. She wasn't born until long after the war ended, but she felt an inexplicable connection to the voices. She said there was something alive in them, something that refused to stay confined to the past. One evening, while the museum was empty, she listened to my tape again, adjusting the volume to catch the faint background hum. It wasn't static. It was rhythmic, almost organic. It sounded like breathing. Intrigued, she played it through a digital filter separating the layers of sound. Beneath my voice, she discovered faint traces, low frequencies, irregular, like overlapping heartbeats. "It's probably mechanical resonance," her colleague said. But Anna wasn't convinced. She listened again. Between the beats, she heard something else. Fragments of words, too soft to be certain, but undeniably human. She replayed the section over and over until she could make out a phrase. "You survived." The same words I had heard in the ruins decades earlier. For a moment she froze. Rationally, she knew it was just distortion, a coincidence born of magnetic degradation and old equipment. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was listening to something more than history. Maybe memory had left its fingerprint on the tape. Maybe sound itself had learned to remember. The next day, she added a note beside my recording, recovered from analog reel, recorded 1954. background hum remains unexplained. It wasn't a scientific statement, but it was honest. Visitors began to notice the note, and some claimed they could hear whispers too. Soon, the tape became one of the museum's most visited exhibits. People didn't come to hear facts, they came to feel something, to understand what silence could carry. Among the visitors was a man in his 60s, a veteran of another war. He stood in the room for nearly an hour, eyes closed, listening. When the tape ended, he approached Anna. "He wasn't crazy," he said quietly. "Sometimes you hear them, the ones who didn't make it. They talk when it's quiet enough." Then he left without leaving a name. That night, Anna couldn't sleep. She dreamt of ruins, grey, endless, echoing with voices. In her dream, she saw a man standing amid the rubble, holding a recorder. He wasn't frightened. He was listening. When she woke, the echo of that dream stayed with her, like a pulse beneath the world's noise. A few months later, she proposed a new project, to digitally restore all the archived testimonies and release them online under one title, The Human Frequency. Each recording would be paired with maps, letters, and diary fragments to reconstruct the war through the sounds of those who lived it. The museum approved. For the first time, thousands of voices once buried in reels of dust and oxide would breathe again. During the restoration, she found another anomaly on my tape, a brief click, followed by a faint whisper that sounded almost like a sigh. She slowed it down, enhanced the frequency, and there it was, my voice, softer, weaker, speaking words she didn't remember hearing before. "If you're listening," it said, "then we made it. That's all that matters." Anna sat in silence. The sentence felt like a message, not to the past, but to the future. To anyone who still cared enough to listen, when the Human Frequency launched online, millions of people from around the world tuned in. Students, historians, veterans, and strangers listened to the voices of forgotten soldiers. They left comments, fragments of emotion typed into the digital void. "My grandfather never talked about the war, but now I think I understand him. I heard this with my son. We both cried. It's strange. I don't know this man, but I feel like I do." The recording that began as a whisper in the ruins had traveled across generations, finding new listeners, new hearts to inhabit. The past, it seemed, wasn't gone. It had simply changed its medium, from air to tape, from tape to data, from memory to resonance. Every listener added another echo to the chain. One evening, after closing time, Anna returned to the museum. She dimmed the lights and let my recording play one last time through the original reel-to-reel player. The hum filled the room again, steady and familiar. She closed her eyes and imagined standing in those ruins, hearing what I once heard. The voice that said you survived. And maybe in her own way she answered. When the reel ended, the tape clicked. That same sound that had once meant silence. But this time, it wasn't an ending. It was a breath. A pause before continuation. In the years that followed, the recording traveled far beyond the museum. It appeared in documentaries, sound installations, and podcasts. Musicians sampled the hum, turning it into an ambient track called The Frequency of Memory. Psychologists used it in lectures about trauma and survival. Even AI researchers studied the waveform, fascinated by how emotion seemed embedded in the noise. Yet despite all the analysis, the mystery remained. Why did people feel so deeply connected to it? Perhaps it wasn't about the words at all, but about what lingered between them. The pauses, the inhalations, the moments where silence carried meaning. That's where truth hides, after all. Not in the things we say, but in the spaces we leave unsaid. On the anniversary of the exhibit, Anna stood before a new audience. The museum had expanded, and a section was now dedicated to the Voices of Reconstruction. Behind her, a screen displayed a single line of text. "The war doesn't end when the guns stop. It ends when the echoes finally fade." She pressed play. My voice emerged once more, steady, aged, human. "People think memory is a way to keep the past alive," I said. "But sometimes it's how the past keeps you alive." The crowd fell silent. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the glass roof, the same rhythm that once filled the ruins. The sound merged with the recording, blurring time until there was no longer a difference between then and now, only the hum of remembrance. Later that night, when the museum emptied, the room was quiet again. The tape machine rested, the red light fading to black. But if you stood very still, you might swear you could hear something, a faint whisper, maybe just the building settling, or maybe the past, still breathing beneath the floorboards. Not haunting, just existing, waiting to be heard again, because that's what stories do. They don't end. They wait quietly for someone to listen.